the book that can reprogram your mind. Introduction. There is a curious fact about the human mind, one so simple that most people pass their entire lives without ever examining it. Every experience you have ever lived, every success you have celebrated, every obstacle you have struggled to overcome has passed through a single gateway, the gateway of thought. And yet, while humanity has developed extraordinary knowledge about the outer world, about physics, chemistry, engineering and technology, very few have paused to ask a more profound question. What are the laws that govern the mind itself? We live in an age of remarkable innovation. Machines can calculate with astonishing precision. Satellites circle the Earth. Information travels instantly across continents. But the inner world, the world of thought, belief, and consciousness, remains largely unexplored by most people. It is as though humanity has built vast cities, crossed oceans, and reached toward the stars, while forgetting to study the most powerful instrument it possesses: the mind. More than a century ago, a quiet but brilliant thinker named Thomas Troward began to speak about this very subject. Drawing upon philosophy, logic, and a deep understanding of spiritual law, he proposed something both simple and revolutionary. The mind operates according to definite laws. Just as gravity governs the movement of the planets, just as mathematics governs the structure of the physical world, there are laws governing the operation of thought. These laws do not belong to any religion. They are not confined to any nation, culture, or philosophy. They are universal principles operating silently in every human life, whether one understands them or not. And this is the remarkable truth that forms the foundation of this audiobook. Most people are already using these laws every day, but they are using them unconsciously. Thought after thought passes through the mind. Ideas repeat themselves. Beliefs slowly take root. Over time, these beliefs shape perception, influence decisions, and guide actions. Eventually, they crystallize into the conditions we call life. From this perspective, the circumstances surrounding us are not random events appearing from nowhere. They are, in many ways, the natural outgrowth of patterns that have been forming quietly within the mind. Patterns of thought, patterns of belief, patterns of expectation. If this idea is new to you, pause for a moment and consider it carefully. Every building begins as an idea in the mind of an architect. Every invention begins as a concept in the imagination of a creator. Every journey begins with a decision. In the same way, the larger structure of our lives is also shaped by ideas, ideas that we have accepted, repeated, and allowed to influence our thinking over time. But here lies the deeper discovery that thinkers like Thomas Troward brought to light. If the mind operates according to law, then those laws can be understood. And if they can be understood, they can also be applied. In other words, the patterns shaping your life are not fixed. They are not permanent. They are the result of mental activity. Activity that can be observed, directed, and gradually transformed. This is not a theory built on wishful thinking. It is a principle rooted in careful observation. Thought precedes action. Action shapes experience. Experience reinforces belief. And belief, once firmly established, becomes the invisible blueprint guiding future thoughts and actions. Thus the cycle continues, quietly, persistently, often without our awareness. Many people spend their lives reacting to this cycle, believing themselves to be victims of circumstance or prisoners of fate. But those who begin to understand the laws of the mind discover something extraordinary. They realize that thought itself is not merely a passive response to the world. It is a creative force, a force that interacts with perception, behavior, and environment in subtle yet powerful ways. This realization changes everything, because once we understand that thought has structure, that belief has influence, and that mental patterns shape the direction of life, We are no longer helpless observers of our circumstances. We become participants in the creative process. Not through magic or superstition, but through understanding, through discipline, through the deliberate cultivation of ideas that lead toward greater clarity, confidence, and purpose. The purpose of this audiobook is not to offer quick formulas or passing inspiration. Its purpose is far more significant. It is to explore the principles through which the mind can be understood and ultimately directed. In the chapters that follow, we will examine the nature of thought, the influence of belief, the structure of mental cause and effect, and the remarkable ability of the human mind to reshape its own patterns. You will discover why certain ideas quietly govern behavior, why repeated thoughts become powerful influences in life, and how conscious direction of the mind can gradually transform the course of experience. In many ways, what you are about to hear may feel like a lecture from another era, an era when philosophers carefully examined the deeper laws of life. And yet, these ideas may feel surprisingly modern. Because while technology has transformed the outer world, the inner workings of the mind remain exactly the same. The same laws that operated 100 years ago operate today. The same principles shaping the lives of thinkers, leaders, inventors, and creators throughout history continue to operate in the life of every individual now listening to these words. Which leads to a question both simple and profound. If the mind follows law, and if those laws influence the direction of life, what might happen if we began to understand them? What might change if the patterns of thought that have quietly guided our past could be examined, refined, and redirected? And what possibilities might open if the mind, rather than drifting through habits formed long ago, became a consciously directed instrument? These are the questions that will guide our journey. And as we begin, remember this. The laws of the mind are always in operation. They are shaping thought. They are shaping perception. And, little by little, they are shaping the story of your life. The only question that remains is this: will those laws continue to operate unconsciously, or will you begin to understand them? Let us begin.
Chapter 1. The Universal Mind Behind All Thought. Before we can speak about reprogramming the mind, we must first understand a question that few people ever ask. What is the mind? Most people assume that the mind is simply the activity of the brain, a biological process taking place within the skull. Thoughts appear, disappear, and move from one subject to another like clouds drifting across the sky. But thinkers such as Thomas Troward proposed a far more profound view. According to Troward, the mind is not merely an isolated function of the body, it is part of a much larger principle operating throughout the universe itself. In his lectures, especially in the Edinburgh Lectures on mental science, he explained that the universe is not fundamentally mechanical, it is mental in nature. This idea may sound unusual at first, yet when examined carefully, it begins to reveal a remarkable logic. Consider the world around you. Every invention that exists today began as an idea in someone's mind. The buildings that shape our cities were once nothing more than sketches in the imagination of architects. The technology that connects the world started as concepts formed in the thoughts of inventors. In other words, the material world we experience is, in many ways, the result of thought expressed in form. Thought precedes structure. Idea precedes creation. This observation led philosophers throughout history to a striking conclusion: mind is not simply a product of reality, it is deeply involved in the formation of reality. Troward took this insight even further. He proposed that behind every individual mind there exists a greater intelligence, an infinite mental principle from which all thought emerges. He called this principle universal mind. Universal mind is not a personality, nor is it limited to any religious interpretation. Rather, it is the underlying intelligence that sustains the order of the universe. It is the reason mathematical laws remain consistent. It is the reason nature follows precise patterns. It is the reason the universe operates with such astonishing harmony. Every star follows its path. Every seed grows according to its design. Every living organism develops through orderly processes. This universal order suggests that intelligence exists at the foundation of reality. But here is the extraordinary part of Troward's insight. The human mind is not separate from this universal intelligence. It is an expression of it. Each individual consciousness functions as a center of awareness within the greater field of universal mind. In other words, the thoughts you experience are not produced in isolation. They arise within a vast mental framework that permeates existence itself. Imagine the ocean for a moment. On the surface of the ocean, countless waves rise and fall. Each wave appears to have its own shape, its own movement, its own brief existence. Yet every wave is made of the same water. The wave is not separate from the ocean. It is simply a temporary expression of it. Troward suggested that the relationship between the individual mind and the universal mind is similar. Each person appears to possess an independent consciousness, yet that consciousness exists within a greater field of intelligence. The individual mind is like a wave rising from the ocean of universal mind. Why is this idea important? Because it changes the way we understand the power of thought. If the mind were merely a random byproduct of brain activity, its influence would be limited. Thoughts would come and go without any deeper connection to the structure of reality. But if the mind is connected to a universal mental principle, then thought becomes something far more significant. It becomes a creative force operating within a larger field of intelligence. This does not mean that every passing thought instantly shapes the universe. The process is far more subtle and structured than that. But it does mean that thought participates in the formation of experience. The ideas we accept influence perception. Perception influences action. Action shapes the conditions we encounter, and those conditions reinforce the ideas that produce them. Gradually, a pattern forms, a pattern of thinking that becomes a pattern of living. This is the beginning of what we might call the mental program. Most people inherit these programs without realizing it. From childhood, suggestions flow continuously into the mind. Parents, teachers, culture, and environment all contribute ideas that shape how we interpret the world. Some of these ideas encourage confidence and creativity. Others quietly plant doubt, limitation, or fear. Over time, these repeated impressions become beliefs. And once a belief becomes established, it begins to influence behavior automatically. The mind accepts it as reality. Here we begin to see the profound importance of understanding mental law. If our thoughts are connected to a greater creative intelligence, and if repeated ideas become beliefs, and if beliefs guide our perception and actions, then the direction of life is not determined only by external circumstances. It is also shaped by the patterns of thought we carry within us. This does not mean that we control every event in the outer world. Life is far more complex than that. But it does mean that the mind plays a powerful role in how experience unfolds. The internal atmosphere of thought influences the way we interpret situations, the choices we make, and the opportunities we recognize. Two people may stand before the same circumstance and see entirely different possibilities. One sees a limitation. The other sees opportunity. The difference lies not in the situation itself, but in the pattern of thought through which it is interpreted. This is why understanding the mind is so important. If we do not examine our thoughts, we live according to patterns that may have formed years or even decades earlier. Patterns inherited from the past, patterns reinforced by repetition, patterns that quietly guide behavior without our awareness. But once we begin to understand the relationship between the individual mind and the universal mind, a new possibility appears. Thought becomes something we can observe, something we can direct, something we can gradually refine. Instead of drifting through inherited mental patterns, we begin to recognize that the mind is an instrument, one capable of extraordinary creative influence when used consciously. This realization marks the first step toward reprogramming the mind, because before we can change our mental patterns, we must first understand the nature of the mind itself. We must recognize that thought is not merely a fleeting activity inside the brain. It is part of a larger process through which experience takes form. And once we understand this, we can begin to ask a far more powerful question. If the mind participates in the creative structure of life, then what happens when we deliberately change the ideas we hold within it? To explore that question, we must now turn to the next principle of mental science. The principle that explains how thought becomes cause and how the conditions of life emerge as its effect. Chapter 2. The individual mind as a creative center. Now that we have explored the idea of a universal mind, the infinite intelligence underlying all existence, we arrive at a question that lies at the very heart of mental science. If universal mind is the source of all intelligence, what role does the individual mind play within it? According to Thomas Troward, each human being is far more than a passive observer moving through the events of life. Each individual is a creative center within universal mind. This statement, simple as it may seem, carries profound implications. It means that the human mind is not merely receiving impressions from the world around it. It is also contributing to the formation of experience through the ideas it holds. To understand this, let us consider an analogy. Imagine sunlight streaming across the earth. The sun itself is vast and powerful, radiating light in every direction. Yet the sunlight becomes visible in particular places depending on the surfaces that receive it. A mirror reflects it one way. A crystal refracts it into colors. A dark surface absorbs it. The source remains the same, but the expression changes according to the form through which it passes. Troward suggested that the relationship between universal mind and individual consciousness operates in a similar way. Universal mind is infinite intelligence, the boundless source of creative possibility. But each individual mind acts as a point of focus, a place where that intelligence expresses itself in a unique form. In other words, every person is a center through which creative thought flows into expression. This does not mean that the individual mind possesses infinite power in isolation. Rather, its power lies in its relationship with the greater intelligence from which it arises. Just as a wave gains its movement from the ocean, the individual mind gains its creative potential from the universal intelligence in which it exists. Once this idea is understood, an important realization emerges. Thought is not merely a reaction to circumstances. It is an activity that participates in the formation of circumstances. This is because every thought contains a direction. Every idea carries a pattern, and when a pattern is repeated consistently within the mind, it begins to shape perception, behavior, and decision. Over time, these patterns accumulate. They become habits of thought, and habits of thought gradually shape habits of action. The process is subtle but remarkably powerful. Consider how a belief begins to influence life. Suppose a person repeatedly entertains the idea that opportunities are scarce, that success is reserved for others, or that circumstances are always working against them. At first, this belief may seem like nothing more than a passing thought. But if the idea is repeated frequently enough, it begins to influence how that person interprets events. They begin to notice obstacles more readily than opportunities. They hesitate where confidence would have opened doors. They withdraw where action might have produced progress. Over time, these reactions reinforce the original belief. The mind begins to say, "You see, the world really is against me." In this way, a pattern of thought slowly becomes a pattern of experience. The belief acts like a lens through which reality is interpreted, but the same process can operate in the opposite direction as well. When a person begins to cultivate ideas of possibility, confidence, and constructive expectation, the mind gradually becomes more attentive to opportunities. Decisions change, actions shift, new results begin to appear. Again, the pattern reinforces itself. This is why Troward emphasized the extraordinary importance of understanding the creative role of the individual mind. Each thought contributes, in some degree, to the pattern of life being formed. This does not mean that every single thought instantly manifests as an event in the outer world. The universe operates through complex interactions involving many factors. But it does mean that persistent mental patterns become powerful influences over time. Thought organizes perception, perception guides action, action shapes circumstance, and circumstance strengthens belief. This cycle continues until it is consciously examined. Most people never pause to observe this process. Thoughts arise automatically. Beliefs form unconsciously. Reactions follow habit. Life unfolds along paths that feel predetermined. But when we recognize that the individual mind is a creative center, something remarkable happens. We begin to see that thought can be directed. Instead of allowing every passing idea to occupy the mind, we can begin to observe the patterns that shape our thinking. We can ask questions such as, what ideas do I repeat most often? What assumptions quietly guide my decisions? What expectations influence how I see the world? These questions reveal something important. Many of the beliefs guiding our lives were not chosen deliberately. They were inherited from past experiences, absorbed from the environment, or accepted without examination. Yet once these ideas become established in the mind, they begin to operate automatically, like programs running in the background of a computer. This brings us to a crucial insight. If the mind can operate through unconscious patterns, it can also operate through conscious direction. The same principle that allows beliefs to form unintentionally can also be used to cultivate ideas deliberately. Thought can be guided, beliefs can be reshaped, mental patterns can be refined. This is the beginning of what we might call mental reprogramming. But before we can understand how this process works, we must first explore another principle, one that lies at the very core of Troward's philosophy. The principle that every thought produces an effect, that every mental pattern becomes a cause, and that the conditions of life are, in many ways, the visible expression of invisible ideas. In the next chapter, we will examine this principle more closely. The law that connects thought and experience, the law of mental cause and effect. Chapter 3. The law of mental cause and effect. Throughout the natural world, one principle appears again and again with quiet consistency. Nothing happens without a cause. A seed planted in the soil eventually becomes a tree. A spark ignites a flame. A movement of air produces sound. Every visible event can be traced back to something that preceded it. This relationship between cause and effect forms the foundation of scientific understanding. It allows us to predict outcomes, build technology, and understand the patterns governing nature. But according to Thomas Troward, this principle does not operate only in the physical world. It operates in the realm of thought as well. Just as physical actions produce physical results, mental activity produces corresponding effects in the conditions of life. This is what Troward described as mental causation. At first glance, this idea may appear abstract. Thought seems intangible, something fleeting and invisible. It arises silently within the mind, leaves no physical trace, and disappears just as quickly as it appeared. Yet when we observe life carefully, we begin to notice something remarkable. Every human action begins as a thought. Before a person builds a house, they imagine its structure. Before an inventor creates a machine, they conceive the idea behind it. Before any journey begins, someone decides where they wish to go. Thought is the beginning of every human activity. It is the blueprint from which action proceeds. From this perspective, the relationship between thought and experience becomes clearer. Ideas influence decisions. Decisions shape actions. Actions create results. Results reinforce the ideas that produced them. Thus, the cycle of cause and effect continues. But the influence of thought goes even deeper than this. The mind does not simply generate isolated ideas, it forms patterns of thought. These patterns become habits of thinking that operate quietly in the background of daily life. Some patterns encourage growth and possibility. Others reinforce limitation and doubt. Once established, these patterns influence how we interpret the world around us. Two individuals may encounter the same situation, yet perceive it in entirely different ways. One sees difficulty and assumes failure is inevitable. The other sees a challenge and believes success may still be possible. The external situation is identical. The difference lies in the mental cause that shapes perception. This principle reveals something profound. The conditions we experience in life are not determined solely by external events. They are also influenced by the patterns of thought through which those events are interpreted and acted upon. Thought becomes the starting point. Over time, repeated thoughts establish beliefs. Beliefs guide decisions. Decisions influence the direction of life. In this way, mental patterns gradually become visible in outward experience. This is not an instantaneous process. Thought does not operate like a switch that immediately produces a result. Instead, it functions more like a seed planted in fertile soil. A seed does not become a tree overnight. It grows gradually, responding to conditions and nourishment. But once planted, the seed contains within it the blueprint for the eventual form. Thought operates in a similar manner. An idea accepted by the mind begins to influence behavior and perception over time. As the pattern repeats itself, it gathers strength. Eventually, its effects become visible in actions, relationships, opportunities, and decisions. In many ways, the circumstances of life can be understood as the harvest of mental seeds planted long before. This insight was central to Troward's philosophy. He taught that the mind operates through law just as surely as the physical universe operates through gravity, motion, and energy. Once a mental cause is established and maintained consistently, it begins to produce corresponding effects. This principle explains why certain patterns in life seem to repeat themselves. A person who constantly expects failure often encounters situations that confirm that expectation. Someone who believes they are incapable may avoid opportunities that could prove otherwise. A mind conditioned by doubt will interpret neutral events as negative ones. The pattern reinforces itself. But the same law also explains why individuals who cultivate constructive beliefs often experience different outcomes. When a person begins to expect possibilities rather than limitations, their perception changes. They notice opportunities others overlook. They approach challenges with greater confidence. They persist where others give up. Over time, these differences in perception and action lead to different results. The outer change begins with an inner shift. This does not mean that thought alone controls every event in the external world. Life contains many variables beyond individual control. Yet, within those variables, the patterns of thought we maintain exert a powerful influence. They shape how we respond to circumstances. They influence the choices we make, and those choices gradually determine the path we follow. This is why the law of mental cause and effect is so important to understand. It reveals that the mind is not merely a passive observer of life. It is a participant in the chain of causation. Every belief we accept becomes part of the pattern shaping our experience. Every repeated idea strengthens a particular direction of thought, and every direction of thought eventually influences the conditions we encounter. If we wish to understand how the mind can be reprogrammed, we must first recognize this fundamental principle. Thought is cause. Experience is effect. The invisible patterns of the mind eventually become visible in the structure of life. Once this law is understood, an important possibility emerges. If certain patterns of thought have contributed to the circumstances of the past, then new patterns of thought may influence the direction of the future. The mind is not fixed. Its patterns can change, beliefs can be examined, ideas can be refined, and the causes we establish within the mind can gradually reshape the effects we experience. But this raises another question. If thought possesses this creative influence, how do these mental patterns form in the first place? Why do some beliefs become deeply rooted while others fade away? What determines which ideas take hold within the mind and which ones do not? To answer these questions, we must explore another principle of mental science, the mechanism through which ideas enter the mind and become accepted as truth. In the next chapter, we will examine the quiet yet powerful force that shapes many of our beliefs without our awareness, the power of suggestion. Chapter 4. The hidden power of suggestion. If thought becomes cause, and if repeated patterns of thought eventually shape the direction of life, then an important question naturally follows. Where do these patterns begin? Why do certain beliefs take root so deeply within the mind, while others fade almost immediately? To answer this, we must examine one of the most subtle yet powerful forces influencing human consciousness. The force of suggestion. According to Thomas Troward, the mind possesses a remarkable quality. It is receptive to ideas. It absorbs impressions from its environment continuously, often without conscious awareness. From the moment we enter the world, the mind begins receiving suggestions. Parents describe the world in particular ways. Teachers explain what is possible and what is not. Society offers countless messages about success, limitation, identity, and expectation. Slowly, quietly, these messages accumulate. At first they are merely ideas, but as they are repeated through words, experiences, and observation, they begin to form patterns of belief. Consider a simple example. If a child repeatedly hears that they are capable, intelligent, and creative, the mind begins to accept these descriptions as natural truths. Over time, these ideas influence how that child approaches challenges. Confidence grows, curiosity expands, effort becomes natural. But if the opposite suggestions are repeated, if the child frequently hears that they are inadequate, unlucky, or destined to fail, an entirely different pattern may begin to form. The mind accepts the suggestion. It begins to interpret experiences through that assumption. Actions follow accordingly. Thus the suggestion gradually becomes belief. This process happens so quietly that most people never notice it. Yet suggestion plays an enormous role in shaping the structure of the mind. It influences how we see ourselves. It influences what we believe is possible. And perhaps most importantly, it influences the expectations we carry into the future. These expectations, once formed, become powerful mental forces. They guide attention. They influence decisions. They shape behavior. In many cases, they even determine the opportunities we recognize or fail to recognize in the world around us. But suggestion does not operate only through childhood experiences, it continues throughout life. Every conversation, every piece of information, every story we hear contributes new ideas to the mind. Some suggestions are helpful, others quietly reinforce limitation. And because the mind naturally seeks patterns, repeated suggestions eventually become mental habits. The mind begins to say, "This is simply the way things are." At that point, the suggestion has become a belief, and once a belief is accepted, it begins to influence thought automatically. This is how mental programs form, not through deliberate intention, but through repeated impressions accepted over time. A person may believe they are incapable of success simply because they heard that idea often enough for it to feel true. Another may believe opportunities are abundant because that idea was reinforced repeatedly during their formative years. Neither belief appeared suddenly. Both were gradually installed through suggestion. This realization reveals something important. Many of the beliefs guiding our lives were not consciously chosen. They were inherited, absorbed, accepted without question. They became part of the mental framework through which we interpret reality. This is why people sometimes feel trapped by patterns they do not fully understand. They sense that certain beliefs influence their actions, yet they cannot easily explain where those beliefs came from. But once we understand the role of suggestion, the process becomes clearer. Every idea entering the mind has the potential to become a seed. If the idea is repeated frequently enough, and if it is accepted without resistance, it begins to form a pattern. That pattern gradually becomes belief. And belief begins to shape perception. The remarkable aspect of this process is that the mind does not distinguish sharply between ideas received from the outside and ideas generated within itself. Both can become suggestions. The thoughts we repeat internally act as powerful suggestions to our own minds. If we constantly tell ourselves that something is impossible, the mind begins to accept that instruction. If we repeatedly imagine difficulty, the mind prepares itself to encounter difficulty. But the opposite is also true. Constructive ideas, repeated consistently, can gradually replace older patterns. New beliefs can take root. New expectations can form. This insight reveals an important truth. The mind is not permanently fixed by the suggestions of the past. It remains receptive to new impressions. The same mechanism that allowed beliefs to form unconsciously can also be used deliberately. Thought can be directed. Ideas can be chosen. Suggestions can be repeated intentionally until they become new patterns of belief. In other words, the mind can be reprogrammed. But before we explore how this process works in practice, we must first understand another principle that determines whether a suggestion becomes powerful or remains weak. Not every thought becomes a belief. Not every idea takes root. What gives certain ideas the power to shape the mind? The answer lies in the force that transforms suggestion into conviction, the force known as belief. In the next chapter, we will examine how belief activates the creative influence of thought, and why the ideas we accept as true quietly determine the direction of our lives. Chapter 5. The creative power of belief. If suggestion introduces ideas into the mind, then belief determines which of those ideas become powerful. Not every thought we experience has equal influence. Many ideas pass through the mind briefly and disappear without leaving any lasting trace. But certain thoughts remain. They repeat themselves. They gather strength. Eventually, they become something far more significant than a passing idea. They become a belief. According to Thomas Troward, belief is the point at which thought begins to exert real creative influence. An idea entertained casually has little power. It floats across the mind like a cloud drifting across the sky. But an idea accepted as true begins to take root within the deeper layers of consciousness. Once this happens, the idea no longer remains a simple thought. It becomes part of the structure through which we interpret reality. Belief shapes expectation. Expectation influences perception. Perception guides action, and action gradually forms the conditions of life. This sequence operates so quietly that most people never notice it unfolding. Yet when we observe human behavior carefully, its presence becomes unmistakable. Consider how belief influences possibility. If a person sincerely believes they are capable of learning a new skill, their mind approaches the challenge with curiosity and persistence. Obstacles appear as temporary difficulties rather than permanent barriers. But if that same person believes they lack ability, the situation changes entirely. The mind begins to interpret every difficulty as confirmation of limitation. Effort diminishes, confidence weakens. Eventually, the belief fulfills itself, not because the ability was truly absent, but because the expectation shaped behavior. In this way, belief becomes a silent architect, shaping the direction of experience. It influences what we attempt. It influences how long we persist. It influences how we interpret success and failure. Over time, these influences accumulate. They create patterns, and those patterns gradually shape the course of life. This is why belief possesses such extraordinary creative power. Not because belief magically alters reality, but because it organizes thought, perception, and action in ways that produce corresponding results. A belief acts like a lens through which the world is viewed. Two individuals may encounter the same opportunity, yet their beliefs determine how they interpret it. One may see risk and withdraw. The other may see the possibility and move forward. The difference is not the opportunity itself. It is the belief through which the opportunity is perceived. But belief operates at an even deeper level than perception. It influences identity. The ideas we accept as true about ourselves gradually form a mental picture of who we are. I am confident. I am unlucky. I am capable. I am not good enough. These statements may appear simple, yet when repeated often enough, they become powerful mental patterns. The mind begins to accept them as definitions of identity. And once an identity becomes established, behavior naturally aligns with it. A person who believes they are capable approaches challenges differently than someone who believes they are destined to fail. The belief becomes the framework guiding thought and action. This is why Troward emphasized the importance of examining the ideas we accept as truth. Many beliefs guiding our lives were formed long ago, sometimes in childhood, sometimes through past experiences, sometimes through suggestions absorbed from the environment. Over time, these beliefs became familiar. Because they feel familiar, the mind assumes they must be accurate. But familiarity does not always equal truth. A belief may persist for years simply because it has never been questioned. Once this possibility is recognized, a powerful realization emerges. Beliefs are not permanent facts. They are mental conclusions, conclusions that were accepted at some point in the past. And if a belief was formed through repeated ideas, it can also be reshaped through new patterns of thought. This is one of the most important discoveries in the study of the mind. Belief can change. New ideas can gradually replace older patterns. New expectations can take root. And when belief changes, the patterns of perception and action begin to change as well. This is why mental reprogramming is possible. The mind is not a rigid structure. It is a living process, continually shaped by the ideas we accept and repeat. When we consciously introduce new ideas, nurture them through repetition, and allow them to form new beliefs, the mental pattern begins to shift. And as the pattern shifts, the direction of life can begin to shift with it. But belief alone is not the entire story. There is another element that gives extraordinary influence, an element that amplifies ideas, strengthens impressions, and accelerates the formation of belief. This element is the emotional atmosphere of the mind. In the next chapter, we will explore one of the most fascinating ideas found in the philosophy of Thomas Troward, the concept that thoughts do not remain confined within the mind. They generate a subtle influence that extends outward, an invisible field that shapes how we experience the world. Troward called this influence the mental atmosphere. Chapter 6. The mental atmosphere that shapes reality. There is a subtle influence surrounding every human being, an influence rarely noticed, yet constantly present. It cannot be seen with the eyes, nor measured with instruments. It leaves no visible trace in the air, yet its effects can be observed everywhere in human life. According to Thomas Troward, this influence arises from the activity of thought itself. He referred to it as the mental atmosphere. To understand this idea, consider the way physical environments affect us. Walk into a peaceful garden and you immediately sense calm. Enter a crowded and chaotic room and tension becomes noticeable almost instantly. Even without words being spoken, the emotional tone of the environment can be felt. Human beings are sensitive to the atmosphere. But atmosphere is not created only by physical surroundings. It is also created by the state of mind carried by the people within those surroundings. A person who consistently cultivates confidence, clarity, and calm tends to generate a presence that influences others. Conversations become easier. Decisions feel more certain. Opportunities appear more visible. On the other hand, a mind dominated by fear, doubt, or resentment often produces an entirely different effect. Tension spreads through interactions, possibilities appear smaller, energy becomes fragmented. In both cases, something invisible is influencing the environment. This is what Troward meant by mental atmosphere. Thought does not exist in isolation. When repeated consistently, it forms a psychological environment around the individual, an internal climate that influences perception, behavior, and relationships. Over time, this internal atmosphere begins to shape the way the outer world is experienced. A person whose mental atmosphere is dominated by the expectation of difficulty tends to approach situations cautiously, often noticing obstacles before opportunities. A person whose mental atmosphere is guided by constructive expectation approaches the same situations with openness and confidence. The external conditions may be similar, yet the experiences produced are entirely different. This difference emerges from the atmosphere created by the mind. The idea becomes clearer when we observe how emotional states influence human interaction. Imagine meeting someone who radiates genuine enthusiasm and curiosity. Conversation flows naturally. Ideas seem to appear more easily. Possibilities feel larger. Now, imagine encountering someone deeply absorbed in pessimism or anxiety. Even neutral situations may feel heavy or restricted. In both cases, the mental state of the individual affects the environment around them. Thought generates atmosphere, and atmosphere influences experience. Troward suggested that this atmosphere functions like a field of influence extending from the mind, not in a mystical sense detached from reason, but as a natural consequence of how thoughts organize perception and behavior. The mental atmosphere carried by an individual influences how they interpret events. It influences how they communicate with others. It influences how they respond to opportunity or difficulty. Gradually, these influences accumulate. The mental atmosphere becomes part of the pattern shaping life. This idea also helps explain why certain patterns of experience repeat themselves. If a person consistently maintains a mental atmosphere of expectation, positive or negative, that expectation influences behavior over time. Confidence encourages initiative. Doubt encourages hesitation. Initiative often leads to discovery. Hesitation often leads to missed opportunities. Thus, the atmosphere generated by thought begins to shape the sequence of events that follow. It is not that the world instantly rearranges itself in response to every thought. Rather, the mental environment created by repeated patterns of thinking influences the way we engage with the world, and that engagement gradually shapes results. In this way, thought becomes both cause and environment. It is the origin of action, and it is also the atmosphere through which action unfolds. Once we recognize this principle, an important realization emerges. If our mental atmosphere influences our experience of life, then the quality of our thinking matters profoundly. The ideas we repeat, the expectations we cultivate, the beliefs we nurture, all contribute to the environment in which our actions take place. Most people never consciously examine this atmosphere. They accept whatever patterns of thought arise, assuming that mental habits are simply part of their personality. But personality itself is largely the result of repeated thought patterns, and repeated thought patterns can change. When a person begins to deliberately cultivate constructive ideas of possibility, clarity, and purpose, the internal atmosphere gradually transforms. This transformation does not happen overnight. Like the climate, mental atmosphere develops through consistency. But once new patterns of thought begin to stabilize, the internal environment changes. Perception becomes clearer, confidence grows, action becomes more deliberate. And as actions shift, experiences begin to shift as well. This is one of the most powerful implications of mental science. By guiding thought, we gradually influence the atmosphere in which our lives unfold. Yet if this principle is so significant, one might wonder why more people do not consciously direct their mental patterns. Why do so many individuals remain bound by the same cycles of thought for years, even decades? Why do old beliefs persist, even when they produce unwanted results? To answer these questions, we must explore the forces that keep mental patterns in place. In the next chapter, we will examine the reasons most minds remain conditioned by the past, and why understanding those forces is essential for anyone seeking to reprogram the mind. Chapter 7. Why most minds remain conditioned. If the mind possesses the ability to shape patterns of thought, if beliefs can influence perception and action, and if mental atmosphere gradually affects the direction of life, then a natural question arises. Why do most people remain bound by the same patterns of thinking year after year? Why do individuals continue repeating habits of thought that limit their growth, even when those habits produce results they do not desire? To answer this question, we must understand something fundamental about the nature of the human mind. The mind seeks familiarity. Familiar ideas feel safe. Familiar beliefs feel comfortable. Even when those beliefs create limitations, they still provide a sense of psychological stability. This is because once a mental pattern has been repeated long enough, it becomes part of the mind's automatic structure. Thought begins to follow the same pathways repeatedly. Much like a trail worn into the ground by countless footsteps, these pathways become easier to follow the more often they are used. Eventually, the mind begins to move along them without conscious effort. This is what we call conditioning. According to Thomas Troward, much of human behavior is governed by patterns of thought that have become habitual. Ideas repeated often enough begin to operate automatically. They no longer feel like beliefs, they feel like reality itself. A person who has repeatedly told themselves that opportunities are scarce may not experience this idea as a belief. They experience it as an obvious fact about the world. Someone who has long believed they are incapable of success does not interpret challenges neutrally. Every difficulty appears as confirmation of their assumption. The belief quietly filters perception. Over time, this filtering process becomes so natural that the individual rarely questions it. This is one of the most powerful aspects of mental conditioning. Once a belief becomes familiar, the mind tends to defend it, even if the belief limits growth. The reason is simple. The mind prefers stability over uncertainty. Changing a belief requires the mind to release a familiar pattern and accept a new one. At first, this new pattern feels uncomfortable. It contradicts the established mental structure. The mind resists the change. This resistance is one reason people often struggle when attempting to change their thinking. They may consciously decide to adopt new ideas of possibility, confidence, or growth, but the older patterns still exist beneath the surface. When the new thought appears, the mind compares it with the older belief. If the new idea conflicts too strongly with the established pattern, the mind rejects it. It returns to the familiar belief. This is why mental transformation requires more than a single moment of inspiration. It requires repetition, consistency, and patience. Just as the original beliefs were formed through repeated suggestions over time, new patterns must be established through repeated constructive ideas. The mind gradually accepts what it encounters often enough. But conditioning does not arise only from personal thoughts. The environment also plays a powerful role. Family beliefs, cultural expectations, social influences, and daily conversations all contribute suggestions to the mind. If a person lives in an environment where limitation is constantly reinforced, those ideas are repeated frequently enough to feel natural. The mind absorbs them without realizing it. Over time, these external suggestions blend with internal beliefs, creating a powerful network of mental patterns. Breaking free from these patterns requires awareness. One must first recognize that many thoughts appearing in the mind are not original discoveries. They are echoes of ideas absorbed from the environment, ideas repeated so often that they began to feel like personal truths. Once this recognition occurs, a new possibility emerges. The individual can begin to observe their thoughts rather than automatically accepting them. Instead of assuming every idea is accurate, the mind can ask questions. Is this belief helpful? Is it based on evidence or simply repetition? Does it expand possibilities or does it quietly impose limitations? This process of observation is the first step toward freedom from conditioning. Because once a belief is seen clearly, it can be examined. And once it is examined, it can be changed. But even after this awareness appears, another challenge remains. The mind must learn to direct its thinking intentionally. Without direction, thoughts drift according to habit. Old patterns return. The mental atmosphere reverts to familiar tendencies. This is why understanding mental law is not enough by itself. Knowledge must be applied. Thought must be guided. And the mind must learn to cultivate ideas deliberately, rather than passively accepting whatever suggestions appear. This leads us to the next principle in the study of mental science, the principle that transforms awareness into action, the principle through which the mind begins to move from unconscious habit to conscious creation. In the next chapter, we will explore the practice that allows this transformation to occur. The practice is known as conscious direction of thought. Chapter 8. The Principle of Conscious Thought Direction. Up to this point, we have explored several important principles. We have seen that the mind is not isolated, but exists within a greater field of intelligence described by Thomas Troward as universal mind. We have seen that thoughts become causes and that repeated ideas gradually shape patterns of belief. We have also seen how suggestion installs these beliefs, how belief influences action, and how the atmosphere of the mind affects the way life is experienced. But understanding these principles raises a crucial question. If thought has such influence, how do we begin to guide it? Because the difficulty most people face is not a lack of intelligence, it is a lack of direction. The mind has a natural tendency to wander. Ideas appear randomly, often influenced by habit, environment, or emotion. Without conscious guidance, thought moves along the same familiar pathways formed in the past. Old patterns repeat themselves. Old expectations continue shaping perception. The mind becomes reactive rather than creative. This is why Troward emphasized one of the most important practices in mental science, the conscious direction of thought. To direct thought consciously means to become aware of the ideas occupying the mind and to deliberately choose which ideas are allowed to remain. This does not mean suppressing every passing thought. The mind naturally produces impressions throughout the day. Rather, it means recognizing that we possess the ability to select the patterns we cultivate. Just as a gardener chooses which seeds to plant and which weeds to remove, we can learn to choose which thoughts we encourage and which we allow to fade away. At first, this process requires attention. Because many mental habits operate automatically, we must begin by observing the patterns already present. What ideas appear most often? What assumptions quietly guide our reactions? What expectations arise when we face opportunity, challenge, or uncertainty? This observation reveals something important. Many thoughts that appear spontaneous are actually echoes of past conditioning. They repeat because they have been repeated before. Once we recognize this, we can begin introducing a new influence into the mind. Deliberate thought. Instead of allowing every suggestion to shape our mental atmosphere, we begin choosing ideas intentionally, ideas that encourage clarity, ideas that strengthen confidence, ideas that expand possibility. Over time, these chosen ideas begin to form new mental patterns. At first, the change may feel subtle. Old habits of thought still exist. They may reappear automatically. But each time a constructive idea is repeated consciously, it strengthens a new pathway in the mind. Gradually, the new pattern becomes easier to follow. The old pattern becomes weaker through disuse. In this way, thought can be trained. Just as the body develops strength through repeated exercise, the mind develops direction through repeated attention. This practice does not require force or strain, it requires consistency. Each day offers countless opportunities to guide thought. When a negative expectation appears, it can be examined rather than accepted. When doubt arises, it can be replaced with a more constructive idea. When the mind drifts toward limitation, attention can gently redirect it toward possibility. Over time, these small adjustments accumulate. The mental atmosphere changes. Beliefs begin to shift. Actions follow new patterns. And as actions change, experiences begin to change as well. This is the practical application of mental law. Thought, once unconscious and automatic, becomes deliberate and purposeful. But the process becomes even more powerful when thought is combined with clear intention. When we know the direction we wish our lives to move toward, whether it is growth, creativity, contribution, or achievement, we can align our thinking with that direction. Thought becomes organized around purpose. Ideas that support the desired direction are cultivated. Ideas that contradict it gradually lose influence. In this way, the mind becomes an instrument rather than a random stream of impressions. It begins to function with clarity, and clarity generates momentum. This is why the conscious direction of thought is such an essential step in reprogramming the mind. Without direction, thought follows habit. With direction, thought begins to create new patterns, but conscious thought alone is not always enough. For the mind to truly accept a new pattern, the idea must be repeated with consistency and reinforced through imagination and feeling. When thought, emotion, and imagination work together, a powerful shift occurs. A new belief begins to take root. And once belief begins to change, the entire structure of mental patterns can gradually transform. In the next chapter, we will explore the practical method through which this transformation takes place. The method by which ideas move from simple thoughts to establish beliefs. The method through which the mind can be reprogrammed. Chapter 9. The method of reprogramming the mind. If thought creates patterns, and if patterns of thought become beliefs that shape the direction of life, then the next question becomes both simple and profound. How can those patterns be changed? How can a mind conditioned by years of repetition begin to adopt new ideas? According to the principles described by Thomas Troward, the answer lies not in force, struggle, or sudden transformation. It lies in understanding the natural laws through which the mind forms beliefs. Just as old patterns were formed through repetition, suggestion, and emotional acceptance, new patterns must be established through the same process. Mental reprogramming is, therefore, not mysterious. It is systematic. It begins with awareness. Before any change can occur, one must first recognize the patterns that already exist within the mind. Many thoughts operate automatically, repeating ideas inherited from past experiences. Some of these ideas may support growth. Others may quietly reinforce limitations. The first step is to observe these patterns without judgment. What ideas arise most often? What expectations appear when facing new opportunities? What inner dialogue accompanies moments of difficulty? Once these patterns are recognized, the next step becomes possible. Selection. Not every idea deserves a place in the mind. If a belief limits possibility or contradicts the direction we wish our lives to take, it can be replaced with a more constructive idea. This does not mean denying reality or pretending difficulties do not exist. Rather, it means choosing the ideas through which we approach reality. Instead of repeating thoughts of incapability, the mind can begin cultivating ideas of growth and potential. Instead of dwelling on past limitations, attention can move toward future development. The idea chosen should be clear and constructive. It should represent the direction in which we wish the mind to move. But the introduction of a new idea is only the beginning. For the mind to truly accept it, the idea must be repeated consistently. Repetition is the mechanism through which belief forms. Each time the idea is consciously entertained, it strengthens its presence within the mind. At first, the new thought may feel unfamiliar. Old patterns may attempt to reassert themselves. But persistence gradually alters the mental landscape. Over time, the new idea begins to feel more natural. It moves from conscious effort to subconscious acceptance. In addition to repetition, imagination plays a powerful role in this process. The mind responds strongly to mental imagery. When we imagine ourselves acting with confidence, solving problems creatively, or achieving meaningful goals, we create vivid impressions within consciousness. These impressions reinforce the ideas we wish to cultivate. The mind begins to experience the new pattern internally before it becomes visible externally. Emotion also amplifies this effect. Ideas accompanied by feeling leave deeper impressions. When constructive thoughts are combined with genuine enthusiasm, gratitude, or determination, they become far more influential than thoughts repeated mechanically. In this way, repetition, imagination, and emotion work together. They transform a chosen idea into a new belief. But mental reprogramming does not end with thought alone. Action plays an essential role. As new beliefs begin forming, they must be expressed through behavior. Small actions aligned with the new idea reinforce the emerging pattern. Each action provides evidence that the new belief is valid. Confidence grows. The pattern stabilizes. Gradually, the mind begins to operate according to the new program. Old assumptions lose their influence. New expectations guide perception. Opportunities that once seemed invisible begin to appear. This process may seem gradual, but its effects can be profound. Because when belief changes, perception changes. When perception changes, decisions change. And when decisions change, the direction of life begins to shift. The mind becomes a creative instrument rather than a passive recorder of past conditioning. It becomes capable of shaping new patterns rather than repeating old ones. This is the true meaning of mental reprogramming. It is not the sudden transformation of personality. It is the deliberate cultivation of ideas that gradually reshape belief, perception, and action. And as these inner changes accumulate, the outer structure of life begins to reflect them. But even after understanding this method, one final principle remains. A principle that brings together everything we have explored. Because ultimately, the purpose of understanding the laws of the mind is not merely to change individual thoughts, it is to recognize the role we play in the creative process of life itself. In the final chapter, we will explore this realization, the moment when the individual mind begins to see itself not as a victim of circumstance, but as a participant in the unfolding design of experience. The moment when one becomes the architect of one's own life. Chapter 10. Becoming the architect of your life. Throughout this journey, we have explored a series of ideas that, when taken together, reveal something remarkable about the nature of the human mind. We began with the insight proposed by Thomas Troward, that the universe itself operates through an underlying intelligence, a principle he described as the universal mind. From that foundation, we discovered that each individual mind is not separate from this greater intelligence. Rather, it functions as a creative center within it. We then examined the law of mental cause and effect, recognizing that thoughts do not remain idle within the mind. Repeated ideas form beliefs. Beliefs shape perception. Perception guides action. And actions gradually shape the experiences that unfold in our lives. We explored the power of suggestion and saw how many beliefs were installed long before we were aware of them. Ideas absorbed from family, culture, and experience quietly formed the mental patterns guiding our decisions. We examined the creative power of belief itself, the point at which thought becomes conviction and begins influencing the direction of life. We considered the mental atmosphere generated by repeated thoughts and how this atmosphere shapes the way we engage with the world, and we saw why many minds remain conditioned, repeating familiar patterns simply because those patterns have been reinforced for years. Finally, we discovered that thought can be directed consciously. Ideas can be chosen deliberately. Beliefs can be reshaped through repetition, imagination, emotion, and action. Taken together, these principles reveal a profound realization. Life is not shaped by circumstance alone. It is also shaped by the patterns of thought through which we meet circumstance. The difference between these two perspectives is subtle but transformative. When we believe that life is determined entirely by external forces, we see ourselves as passengers carried along by events. Success appears accidental. Failure appears inevitable. Opportunity appears unpredictable. But when we begin to understand the laws of the mind, a different picture emerges. We begin to see that thought participates in the unfolding of experience, not as an isolated force acting upon the universe, but as a creative element within a larger system of intelligence. In this system, the mind plays an active role. The ideas we cultivate influence the direction of our perception. Perception influences the decisions we make. And those decisions gradually shape the path we follow. This realization does not grant instant control over every event in life. The world remains complex, and many circumstances lie beyond individual influence. But within those circumstances, the mind determines something crucial. It determines how we respond. And response is where the power of thought becomes visible. Two individuals may encounter the same challenge. One interprets it as defeat and withdraws. The other interprets it as an opportunity for growth and persists. The challenge was identical. The outcome differed because the interpretation differed. The interpretation arose from the pattern of thought within the mind. This is why understanding mental law can transform the direction of life. Because once we recognize the influence of thought, we can begin guiding it intentionally. We can cultivate ideas that support growth rather than limitation. We can choose beliefs that encourage creativity rather than fear. We can build a mental atmosphere that strengthens purpose and clarity. Over time, these patterns begin to express themselves through action. Confidence replaces hesitation, initiative replaces doubt, persistence replaces resignation. Gradually, the structure of life begins to reflect the structure of thought. This process does not occur through sudden miracles. It occurs through steady alignment between inner patterns and outward behavior. Thought becomes the blueprint, action becomes the construction, experience becomes the result. This is what it means to become the architect of one's life. An architect does not control the materials of the world, but they understand the laws governing structure and design. They work with those laws deliberately. They form a clear vision, and through consistent effort, that vision gradually takes shape. The mind functions in much the same way. It provides the design through which life is built. The ideas we hold repeatedly become the framework guiding our actions, and actions, repeated over time, construct the reality we inhabit. This is why the study of the mind is so important, because the mind is not merely a tool for reacting to life. It is the instrument through which life is shaped. Once we recognize this, a new sense of responsibility appears. We become aware that every thought contributes in some degree to the pattern we are creating. Every belief strengthens a direction, every expectation influences perception, and every perception influences the actions that follow. The mind becomes the place where possibility begins, the place where patterns are formed, the place where the future quietly takes shape. In this sense, the mind is very much like a book. Every thought is a sentence. Every belief is a paragraph. Every decision becomes a chapter. Day by day, page by page, the story of life is written. Many people spend their lives reading the story written by the beliefs they inherited. But those who understand the laws of the mind discover something extraordinary. They realize that the story is not finished. New ideas can be written, new chapters can begin, and the direction of the narrative can change, because the mind that once accepted every suggestion from the world can now begin to choose its own direction. It can observe its thoughts, it can guide its beliefs, it can cultivate a mental atmosphere aligned with growth and possibility. And as this inner transformation unfolds, the outer story begins to change with it. This is the quiet power of mental science, not the promise of instant transformation, but the understanding that thought, guided consciously, becomes one of the most powerful forces shaping human experience. And once that understanding appears, a final question remains. If the mind participates in the creative structure of life, what kind of thoughts will you choose to cultivate? Because from this moment forward, the architecture of your life is no longer hidden. It begins in the place where every experience begins, in the mind.